A dollar bill from 1971 buys about a dime's worth of goods today. Roughly 90% of its purchasing power gone. And the decision that set it in motion didn't take a decade of debate or an act of Congress or a war. It took one weekend, 15 men, a presidential lodge in the Maryland mountains, 2 days of arguing behind locked doors. And on Sunday evening, August 15, 1971, the President of the United States walked into a television studio, preempted Bonanza in front of tens of millions of viewers, and severed the dollar from gold in a speech that ran barely 18 minutes. Most people watching that night just wanted to know when their Western was coming back on. They had no idea they had just watched the single most consequential economic announcement of the 20th century's second half. Here's what makes that night so strange in hindsight. The system Nixon ended that evening wasn't some dusty relic. It was the financial architecture of the entire Western world, and for a quarter century, it had worked. It was called Bretton Woods, named for the New Hampshire resort town where 730 delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered in July 1944, while the war in Europe was still being fought. The deal they struck was elegant in its simplicity. The United States, which by the late 1940s held something on the order of 2/3 of the world's official gold reserves, would peg its dollar to gold at exactly $35 an ounce, convertible on demand for foreign governments. Every other major currency would then peg itself to the dollar. The pound, the franc, the yen, the Deutsche Mark, all of them anchored to the dollar, and the dollar anchored to a vault. The dollar wasn't just a currency, it was the keystone in an arch, and every other economy in the free world leaned its weight against it. And for a while, the arch held beautifully. The 2 decades after the war produced what French economists still call the 30 Glorious Years. American real GDP roughly doubled between 1948 and 1971. Unemployment in the mid-1960s ran under 4%. Inflation through most of the 1950s and early 1960s drifted, along between 1% and 2% a year. Numbers a modern central banker would frame and hang on the wall. A factory worker in Ohio could buy a house, a car, and a summer vacation on a single income, and the dollar in his pocket bought next year almost exactly what it bought this year. Gold sat at $35 an ounce, year after year after year, as fixed as the speed of light. Nobody under 40 had ever really known anything else, but the system carried a flaw in its foundation, and an economist named Robert Triffin had spotted it as early as 1960, testifying before Congress that the arrangement was doomed by its own design. The logic became known as the Triffin dilemma, and it goes like this. For the world economy to grow, the world needed more dollars. Dollars to settle trade, dollars to hold as reserves. The only way to supply them was for America to send more dollars out than it took in. But every dollar that piled up in a foreign central bank was a claim check on American gold. The more successful the system became, the more claim checks accumulated, and the gold pile didn't grow to match. By the late 1960s, foreign official institutions and markets held far more dollars than the United States could ever redeem. Estimates at the time put dollars abroad at several times the value of the gold in American vaults. The keystone was being asked to hold an arch that kept getting heavier, which raises the question that hung over Washington for a decade. Who would blink first? The foreigners holding the claim checks or the country holding the gold? By 1971, we were about to find out. The warning signs came in a sequence, each one louder than the last. First, the spending. Through the 1960s, the United States ran the Vietnam War and the Great Society programs simultaneously, without the tax increases to fully fund either. Guns and butter at dollars. The same time, financed in part by money creation. Federal outlays climbed, deficits widened, and dollars flowed abroad in a thickening stream. Second, the gold drain itself. The U.S. gold stock, which had peaked above 20,000 metric tons in the late 1950s by most accounts, had fallen to roughly 9,000 tons by 1971, more than half the hoard, shipped out one redemption at a time. Third, the collapse of the London gold pool in March 1968, a consortium of central banks that had been quietly selling gold to hold the market price at $35. When speculative demand overwhelmed it, the banks gave up and let a two-tier market emerge, an official price for governments, a floating price for everyone else. The market price drifted above the peg, which told you everything. The world no longer believed the dollar was worth a 35th of an ounce. Fourth, in 1971, the United States posted its first annual merchandise trade deficit since the 19th century. Small by modern standards, but symbolically enormous. And fifth, the foreign government started moving. France under de Gaulle had been famously aggressive about converting dollars to gold for years, at one point reportedly sending vessels across the Atlantic to carry the metal home. By the summer of 1971, the trickle was becoming a queue. In early August, Britain inquired about converting a large dollar position. Accounts differ on the exact figure, with some putting the request near $3 billion. And that, by several insider tellings, was the tripwire. Sound familiar? Because the shape of it rhymes with something happening right now. In 2025, foreign central banks have been net buyers of gold at the fastest sustained pace in decades, well over 1,000 tons a year by World Gold Council tallies in recent years, while quietly trimming the dollar's share of global reserves from over 70% at the turn of the century to under 60% today. Nobody announces a loss of confidence. It shows up first in the vault inventories. It did in 1971 too. So picture the scene. Friday, August 13th, 1971. Helicopters lift off for Camp David carrying 15 men and a secret. Treasury Secretary John Connally, a Texas politician with a gambler's nerve, the man who would later tell European finance ministers, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." Fed Chairman Arthur Burns, pipe in hand, deeply uneasy. Budget Director George Shultz, speechwriter William Safire, who later wrote the inside account, and a tall Treasury Undersecretary named Paul Volcker. Yes, that Volcker, the same man who would spend the next decade cleaning up what this weekend unleashed, who had drafted the contingency plans and who privately worried they were dismantling something that could not be rebuilt. The participants were ordered not to call out. Aspen Lodge in August, cool mountain air, wood paneling, legal pads, the smell of coffee going stale as the arguments ran past midnight. Burns argued against closing the gold window, warning the stock market would tank, and the press would say a president had devalued the dollar. Connally pushed the full package, bold, decisive, televised, somewhere. In those 2 days, the post-war monetary order was voted out of existence by men in weekend clothes, and the world's central banks found out the same way everyone else did. On television, Sunday night, 9 o'clock Eastern, Nixon's package had 3 planks, and it's worth hearing how it was sold, because the framing was the opposite of how history remembers it. A 90-day freeze on all wages and prices in the United States. The first peacetime controls of their kind, a 10% surcharge on imports aimed squarely at forcing Germany and Japan to revalue, and buried third, phrased as a defense of the dollar against what he called international money speculators, the suspension, temporarily, of the dollar's convertibility into gold. Temporarily, that word did a lot of work. The temporary suspension has now lasted 55 years. The Dow actually jumped almost 33 points the next day, then one of its better single-day gains, and Nixon's approval rose. The public cheered the wage freeze and barely registered the gold clause. The keystone had been pulled from the arch, and the crowd applauded the speech. Now, the chart. the one this whole story builds toward. If you laid the lines side by side, here's what you would see, and I want you to actually picture each one. Gold, a flat line at $35 stretching back decades then. After 1971, a line that bends upward and never looks back, past $180 by 1974, past $800 in the January 1980 spike, and, in recent years, trading in the four figures, at times well above $3,000 an ounce. The same metal, only the measuring stick changed. The dollar's purchasing power, a line sliding downhill so steadily that by the Bureau of Labor Statistics' own CPI arithmetic, it takes roughly $8 today to buy what $1 bought. In 1971, that 85 to 90% loss from the opening of this video. Productivity and hourly compensation, two lines that climb together, almost touching, from 1948 until, and you can practically see the date on the chart, the early 1970s when they split. Productivity kept climbing. Typical workers' inflation-adjusted pay flattened into a long plateau. By the Economic Policy Institute's widely cited series, productivity grew several times faster than typical compensation in the half-century after the split, though economists argue hard about how much of that gap traces to 1971 itself versus technology, trade, and policy. Household debt, from under 50% of GDP in the early 1970s to a peak near 100% before 2008. Asset prices, houses, stocks, anything scarce, climbing far faster than wages, decade after decade. One chart, 5 lines, one inflection point, and the inflection point has a date, August 15th, 1971. But the chart only tells you what. The 1970s told America how it would feel. With the golden anchor cut, the inflation that had been leaking into the system burst loose. Consumer prices rose about 3.3% in 1971, then accelerated past 6%, past 11% in 1974 after the Arab oil embargo quadrupled crude prices, easing briefly, then roaring back. Picture the winter of 1973 into 1974. Station wagons lined up 4 blocks deep outside a Texaco station before dawn, engines idling in the cold to hold a place, a hand-painted sign, on the pump reading, "No gas today," odd even rationing by license plate. Price controls, the popular plank of the Camp David package, created shortages of everything from beef to fertilizer. Ranchers reportedly drowned baby chicks rather than raise them at a loss under capped prices. The controls were extended, modified, and finally abandoned, having mostly postponed the pain. A new word entered the language, stagflation, for a combination the textbooks had said was impossible, rising prices and rising unemployment at the same time. By 1979, inflation was running in double digits, and in 1980 it peaked at 14.8% on a 12-month basis, the worst American peacetime inflation of the century. A family that kept $10,000 in a savings account through that decade watched close to half its real value evaporate without ever spending a cent of it. No bank failed, no market crashed, the money simply rotted in place, quietly, the way the claim checks had quietly piled up in the decade before. Ending it required the same Paul Volcker who had stood in Aspen Lodge in 1971. Appointed Fed chairman in 1979, he did the thing politician would. He let interest rates rise until the fever broke. The federal funds rate touched 20% in 1981. Mortgage rates passed 18%. The medicine triggered back-to-back recessions, and by late 1982, unemployment hit 10.8%, the worst since the Depression. Home builders mailed 2x4s to the Federal Reserve in protest. Farmers blockaded its headquarters with tractors. But it worked. Inflation fell from nearly 15% to under 4% by 1983, and the credibility Volcker bought with that pain underwrote the next 40 years of fiat money. And here is where the story stops being simple, because what followed wasn't only loss. Defenders of the post-1971 system make a real case, and an honest telling has to give it. A currency chained to gold cannot be expanded in a panic, which is part of why the Federal Reserve stood largely paralyzed in the early 1930s, while 9,000 banks failed and a recession curdled into the Great Depression. In 2008, freed from any metallic constraint, the Fed created trillions in emergency liquidity and the financial system for all. The damage did not collapse into a second depression. In 2020, when a pandemic shut down the global economy in a matter of weeks, the response was faster still. Flexibility has a price, and it also has a payoff. Economists will be arguing the net balance long after this video is forgotten. What's not in dispute is what the flexibility enabled along the way. The financialization decades. Finance and insurance grew from roughly 4% of US GDP in the early post-war years to around 8% in recent decades. Total credit in the economy exploded. The S&P 500 rose more than 40-fold from the early 1980s. If you owned assets, the post-1971 world was generous to you. If you only earned wages, look back at that chart, at the two lines that stopped touching. I'll be honest with you for a second. I've read the Camp David accounts more times than I can count, and the detail that stays with me isn't the economics. It's that the 15 men spent a real chunk of that historic weekend debating whether interrupting Bonanza would annoy viewers more than the message warranted. The fate of the world's reserve currency and the sticking point was a Sunday night Western. Decisions that echo for half a century rarely feel that large to the people inside the room. So why does this matter today? Not as nostalgia. Had been deteriorating for months beneath a rising index. The crowd was piling into fewer and fewer